short story about a marriage in trouble. Bob woke up at 4 a.m. He lay there, staring at the beam of light shining through the drawn curtains. The only sound was his wife's rhythmic breathing. His appointment wasn't until the evening, but he was too excited to sleep. This was his chance to get into the big leagues. Bob's thoughts were racing as he rehearsed his presentation. He knew every word and every number by heart. This was going to be the best day of his life. Well, yeah. Bob put on a brand new suit and looked as good as he felt. His wife, Annie, had made him look his best. His favorite breakfast, and he couldn't wait to leave. He asked her one last time to go with him, but she said no. They'd celebrate tomorrow night. He didn't blame her. He had half a dozen calls to make to clients before the big meeting. Highland Enterprises thought the whole presentation would last 8 hours. He stowed a dozen boxes of brochures in the backseat of his car and headed for downtown Chicago. His calls to clients went well, and soon he was on his way to a meeting. He parked in the garage across the street from the hotel because of the economy. Expense reports were being checked, so he couldn't use the valet service. He looked at his watch. There were 60 minutes until the show. The meeting time had been chosen to fit in with other things that had come up on the West Coast. It started with cocktails, and then Bob's presentation. He had everything ready to go. He had a very strong evidence base with numerical data on everything. All of his arguments were 100% workable, and they had the best. The product on the market was going to be presented at a formal dinner. Bob was confused when he opened the boot to get his briefcase and laptop and found it empty. He'd been so nervous that morning that he'd simply forgotten to bring them with him. He remembered he'd left them on the kitchen table at rush hour. The drive from the hotel to Bob's house took a little over an hour each way. He was really lucky that his wife was home and could meet him halfway, so he could get back in time for he could even make dessert. Bob laughed, remembering how disappointed he had been when Annie had declined his invitation to spend the night at a boutique hotel downtown. He thought, I don't know what I would have done if she hadn't stayed home, and smiled. Recalling the conversation, he said, You'll be too busy tonight to even remember. I'm there with you. I'm looking forward to ordering pizza, putting on shorts and a sweatshirt, and turning on the good wife. Oh, and a bottle of marrow to keep me company. I promise you, we'll be celebrating all weekend. Annie's phone went to voicemail after a dozen beeps, so he called again and then one more time. Finally, on the fourth try, she picked up. You've only been gone a few hours, so you can't miss me yet, she joked. Annie, thank goodness you answered. Are you still at home? If you weren't my savior, who would I be? I really messed up. I left my briefcase and laptop on the kitchen table. I only have an hour before my presentation, so I need you to grab them and go downtown. I'll call you on the way so we can meet in about 30 minutes. Oh my God, I don't know what to do. I'd rather not. Her answer was a real bummer for him. I can't do that. You know I hate driving on the freeway during rush hour, and then I'd have to drive home in the dark. Annie, please. If there was any other way, I'd do it, he pleaded. But I'm not dressed and I've had a couple glasses of wine. Her voice sounded annoyed. What's that noise in the background? I can barely hear you. It's the TV. Could you turn it down? The volume hasn't changed. Annie, this is the deal that's going to get us the house you've been dreaming of. I need you. Oh, now make me. I feel guilty. I'm in the kitchen, but I can't see them. Are you sure you left them here? They should be there. Please check our bedroom. You might as well check the trash to see if I've done something really stupid. Great. I'll go look in the trash. Thanks, honey. I don't know what I'd do. I'll call you back in 10 minutes. As soon as she hung up, her lover said, Are you really going to spoil our evening? I'm not going to stay long. I'm going to watch my basketball game like I promised my wife I would. She grabbed her coat and kissed him on the cheek. He tried to ask something else, but she pushed him back in his chair. I'm late, lover boy. Annie was annoyed that her fantastic evening hadn't gone as planned. Bob called Mr. Rat, the president of the company, and told him he was running late but would be there as soon as he could. You know how much we're betting on this contract. He was reminded for the 100th time as Annie walked through the hotel lobby. She was suddenly struck by the realization that it would take her almost half an hour to get downtown, and this was at the beginning of the day. Even before the traffic got bad, it was rush hour. It was going to take at least twice as long to get home, and she'd also have to go back to drop off her briefcase and laptop. Annie tried to gather her thoughts. If she didn't meet Bob halfway, he'd probably keep driving until he got to their apartment. She tried to remain calm, but a queasy feeling was beginning to form in her stomach. If he got home before she did, she'd find all his things lying on the kitchen table, exactly where he'd left them. Panic gripped her, frantically rummaging through her purse. For her valet ticket, Annie knew there was no way she could explain why she had lied about being home and why she was dressed like that. She was getting worse by the minute as she thought about how she was jeopardizing her marriage and hurting her husband's career. Tonight had gone downhill. It seemed like an eternity before the poor woman turned her car around. Annie ignored Bob's calls and concentrated on driving like a woman possessed. Every few minutes he called. Once more, she couldn't reply because she'd have to tell him where she was. That would be a disaster. All her carefully crafted lies would crumble to dust. She accelerated down the slip road onto the motorway, only to brake suddenly as the expressway filled with a sea of stoplights. Annie joined the flow of traffic and began maneuvering through the gridlock, doing anything to gain a few precious seconds. Her thoughts went back to the day she'd sat at the dining room table, eating breakfast, next to that briefcase and computer. If only she'd had the foresight to call. If only she'd been more organized, she could have been a big hero and saved the day. Instead, she was too busy preparing for her big date. As she drove along, she pounded her fist on the steering wheel. Just then, traffic opened up a mile west of Downtown. She pressed the gas pedal to the floor and the phone kept ringing. Annie had an idea that might give her the time margin she needed. She answered the next call. "Bob, I've taken this place apart and I think I know where you left your stuff. You said you called customers. Have you tried retracing your steps to see if you accidentally left them?" "There you go, Annie. That's a great idea. But I did it as soon as I noticed they were missing. I had people combing offices and parking lots all over the northwest side of Chicago." Annie thought to herself, "Okay, I'll keep looking." She lied. They have to be somewhere. She passed out before he could ask where she was. Her thoughts were racing as fast as her car. The only thing she was sure of was that she wasn't going back to the hotel. She longed for the excitement of a secret, illicit kiss and a discreet touch. But it was terror clutching her stomach and making her feel nauseous. Annie took a deep breath and tried to make a deal with God, promising to be a good wife if only she could survive the night. Bob parked his car in the lot behind their apartment building and ran inside. He froze as he saw the briefcase and computer, exactly where his wife had said they weren't. He tried to imagine how Annie couldn't have seen them, and exactly where she was and why she hadn't answered the phone. But that mystery would have to wait. He would upload his presentation to Mr. Rady with a brief note. "Something very bad has happened and I can't." He sent the file to the secretary with an indication of how many copies would be needed. Only then did Bob look around the small apartment. His hands shook as he opened the bedroom door. He was relieved to find it empty. The same went for the bathroom. Where could his wife be, he thought. A feeling of dread swept over him. Something was very wrong. Bob tried to figure out what it was. The kitchen counter was clean, so he checked the trash for a pizza delivery box. He found nothing there, nor did he find any leftover slice-in. The fridge was on, and the TV was on too. Bob was hoping to see a repeat of The Good Wife, but it was the Weather Channel instead. He pressed the last button just in case, and the Hallmark Channel filled the screen. There was no glass of wine or half-empty bottle of Merlot, and Bob's soul seemed to scream in agony. He didn't have time to react physically, but he heard the garage door open. He turned off the light and sat down at the kitchen table. Annie was relieved when she didn't see Bob's car in the driveway. She had to go to the front of the house where he always parked. She just had to run inside, grab her bags, and hurry back to town. She figured she'd say she got lost and took a wrong turn on the wrong highway. It was definitely time to play dumb blonde. Annie cringed when she flicked the light switch and saw her husband sitting at the kitchen table. He had left his briefcase and laptop on the table. He didn't say a word, just stared at her. The only sound was the clock on the wall counting down each second, disappearing into eternity. After an awkward moment, Annie said in a quiet voice, "I'm surprised to see you here. Didn't I say I'd meet you halfway?" Bob didn't say anything for a long time. The next meaningful pause lasted even longer. Annie said, "You were right about your briefcase and computer being right here on the dining room table." Although Bob felt like shouting, he sat stoically, not moving his lips. The seconds turned into minutes. "Shouldn't you be heading downtown for your meeting?" Annie looked uncomfortable and down at the floor. She couldn't look her husband in the eye. "You must think I'm an idiot," Bob thought. Tick, tick, tick. "You can tell your boss what an idiot I am and it's all my fault. I'm sorry you're late." "I'm really sorry I messed up." Bob sat silent and motionless. Years ago, he had played golf with a retired Chicago police detective. After 18 holes, he'd regale Bob with stories of crimes solved, and murders were his favorite cases. He took great pride in explaining how he could get a murder suspect to confess. If it weren't for a table and 2 uncomfortable chairs, the interrogation room would always be completely empty. I allowed one other thing, a big old clock high on the wall where the bad guy could watch every second go by. What was even better was that it made a loud ticking sound. Then I would sit him down. He could see the clock and stare at it without saying a word. The first one to speak loses. After 2 minutes, they always say something, usually something stupid. For example, I ignored them and continued to stare in silence. Every minute, they got more and more uncomfortable. Eventually, they always cracked up. Annie's little twitch of the eye when she lied was no longer cute or a small ticking sound. It was time for Bob to speak up. Annie was beginning to panic. She took a couple of steps backward. Bob heard a familiar clicking sound on the vinyl tile floor. He looked down and saw that she was wearing black, patent high-heeled shoes. Her legs were after a long wait. Bob walked over and stood facing his wife. He didn't say anything as he unbuttoned her coat. She was still but didn't try to resist as he pulled it off her shoulders. It fell from her arms and pulled at her feet, revealing the very small black dress Bob had bought for their 4th anniversary. The string of pearls he'd given her last Christmas was slipped over her stunning cleavage. Annie went pale. Every breath seemed to come with difficulty. Bob still didn't say a word. He was scuffing the hem of the dress higher and higher when the silver garters holding up the stockings came into view. The stockings came into view. He lifted the dress a few more inches to expose her. Bob's chest clenched. All he could hear was the sound of the clock ticking as he collapsed into the chair and cried. Annie fell to her knees and pleaded, "Please let me explain. It's not what you think." Bob covered his face with his hands so he couldn't see. Annie started sobbing and Bob was at a loss as to what to do. He was trying to make sense of what she was saying, but it was all jumbled up. He heard a clock ticking and realized it was going to break. They both flinched as Annie's phone rang. Bob held out his hand, demanding the receiver. Annie reached into her bag and handed him her Samsung. Her whole body was shaking. Bob looked at the caller ID. It was Michael, the husband of my sister Carol's sister, and a good friend of his. He didn't answer the call. Bob waited for the ringtone to silence, then opened her phone's menu. She had 1 missed call. He pressed the key to play the message. It said, "Hi, honey, what's keeping you? I changed our order to 7, but I'm a little hungry and not just for the food." Annie rushed to the sink. But no sooner had she done so than she vomited all over the place. It splattered all over the cabinets and the countertop. Bob sat there paralyzed by his wife's betrayal. She was lying on the floor, the room reeking of her. It felt like an age before Bob could finally get his words out, but when he did, his voice was loud and clear. Annie was taken aback by the intensity of his reaction. She'd never seen her husband lose control like this. "Your sister is 8 months pregnant, and you're making love to her husband." He stood up and threw his chair across the room. "Don't play dumb, cheater." "What hotel?" she said. "I don't know which room we met in the bar and I never went upstairs," he replied. He found his sister Annie's name on the favorites list. Carol answered after the second beep. "Hello," he said. "Hi Bob, is this a surprise? Where's Michael?" I asked. "He's at the sports bar in the city watching the Bulls game with some guys from work." Carol said, "When do you expect him back?" "Not until morning," he replied. "He's been complaining about how I never want to do anything for him since I got pregnant, so I threw him a party for the boys. He's spending the night at a friend's apartment from work, so he doesn't have to worry about driving home drunk." She asked anxiously, "Is everything okay?" but got no answer as he had already hung up. Michael called every 15 minutes, leaving message after message, wondering when Annie would be back. All of this was topped off with a crude love hint, "I'll make love to you until you can't walk straight." Neither of them said a word between calls. Annie whimpered like a dog, while Bob grew increasingly frustrated listening to each message. His mind was filled with dark thoughts as he pondered what he should do next. Annie's phone rang again. The message went like this: "I don't know what hole you've fallen into, but we already have a room for the night. We've been hoping for this for a long time. He wanted to make it happen when this affair first started, and he didn't want Annie to see those texts." They sat like that for a long time without saying anything. When the phone rang, he knew he'd got a reply. "I've wanted to sleep with you ever since we met. When will you finally make my dreams come true?" What a rude, low grade, Bob thought. But it shows that they haven't had a love affair so far. Bob finally broke the silence, wondering why Annie didn't answer. He repeated much louder, "I did it because I was jealous. Jealous of what Mike told me about you." I heard stories you never told me. My husband was frankly. I'm surprised you're a notorious one. You won the Who Could Make Love to the Most Women contest, didn't you? I heard you've made love to 12 different women. Did my good friend Michael tell you about some kind of contest? Yeah, he said a few of your friends had the idea to get you out of your depression after your ex. Girlfriend? That's when Bob really let rip. He said he'd never heard me mention my late wife, who was his ex. Annie cringed in fear as he yelled at her. A woman becomes an ex when she gets divorced, he said. Do you understand? Christ became my dead wife when a drunk driver killed her. She never was, and never will be my ex. You're going to be my ex on Monday. Annie looked really scared. She started to beg, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you, let her wail. He just stopped listening to her. Before we were married, I tried to tell you about Christy. You knew she died in a car accident. I don't know how detailed your information is. You said you didn't want to go through the pain of reliving her death. I didn't insist that you tell. I wanted to know more about her life and death. Bob put his head down heavily. You hurt me more today than her death, because she didn't want to die, and everything you did was of your own free will. Annie howled like a soul condemned to hell. I'm sorry. Her face was flooded with tears. I met Christy on my first day of middle school. She came up to me. Christy told me to be her boyfriend, so I said okay, and we were boyfriend and girlfriend until we got married. Christy and I didn't have partners until our first wedding night. We were each other's firsts. I never thought it was possible to be as happy as we were. Everything was going perfectly until one day I forgot to. On my way home from work, I forgot to pick up a gallon of milk. Christy teased me about it and offered to drive us to the grocery store. It was only a couple of miles away. The weather was perfect, the sun was shining, and we were laughing and joking. The light changed to green, and we were the second car in the intersection when an SUV hit us. The police estimated he was going at least 80. I could still hear the horrible sound of the clanking metal. The glass came down on us like snow. It took a while before I could focus on the carnage. Bob could barely contain his sobs. I looked at Christy. Blood was everywhere. I tried to stop the bleeding by pressing my hands over her wounds. I heard people screaming, and someone told me to wait for the ambulance. I pulled myself up to Christy and hugged her. I told her everything was going to be okay. She managed to laugh and said she could always tell when I was lying. Annie was sobbing as hard as I told Bob I loved him, and that was the last thing my Christy said. She died in my arms. He paused. She died because I forgot to pick up the milk. I killed her. I'll have to live with that until I die. Annie wanted to hug him, but she knew he wouldn't let her. After the accident, I spent the next 12 months either in the hospital or in rehab. I had a lot of surgeries and spent a lot of time in rehab centers learning to walk again. I also spent a lot of time in therapy learning how to deal with survivor's guilt. I was alive but felt dead when I first walked outside. My body had lost 125 lb, and I needed a cane to walk. I signed up for a health club and went there every day. It took another 6 months before I stopped being self-conscious. I was conscious about the way I looked by then. I had met a lot of nice people, men and women, but I preferred to live in my fearful memory instead of venturing into the unknown. I was afraid to get close to anyone. My psychiatrist suggested I get a job, even though I had no sales experience. Highland Enterprises took a chance and hired me. Weeks turned into months. My body became fully functional, and I was indeed a good salesman. Michael kept trying to set me up on a blind date. I turned him down, as well as all my other It was a bit of a downer, to be honest. I didn't think I could ever get over it, but Michael kept pushing me to meet a young lady he knew. He described her as stunning, and said she was a total cheater. He also guaranteed that I would make love to her the first time I met her. I replied that I wasn't interested, but he kept at it. Finally, to shut him up, I agreed to go on a double date with him, his now wife Carol, and her sister. They invited me to meet them at an Italian restaurant not far from here. I was pleasantly surprised to see how conservatively dressed she was. This girl was Annie. She was shaking her fist and shouting through her tears. "He's a liar. He's a filthy liar," she kept saying. As the evening went on, Bobby carried on. "I found that I liked my girl," he said. "But as Shakespeare said, a pity she's a cheater." My head was full. I was still thinking about Chris's death, and I didn't want any complications at the end of the evening. As we were leaving, Michael took me aside and whispered, "Make love to her for me." When we got to her house, I thanked her for a wonderful evening. She gave me a peck on the cheek. She gave me a peck on the cheek and then told me that she wasn't inviting me in. Do you remember my answer, Annie? You said that if I invited you in, you would lose all respect for me and I would never see you again. So, that's the answer you've been waiting for. I've loved 2 women, and I'm married to both of them. Have I ever been tempted? Absolutely. Have I ever had a woman try to seduce me? Of course. But I've never even come close to accepting their advances. I take my vows seriously. Annie sank down in front of Bob and rested her face in his lap. He put his hands on her head and said, I wish I had died in the accident. Annie begged Bob to let her explain. He shrugged his shoulders, which she took as permission, and confessed to all that she told him about all the inappropriate things she had done to Michael, including the innuendos and butt patting. For the most part, it was just sophomore pranks, like 2 teenagers in high school. However, there were also a few more serious kisses and touches. Annie sighed. He made me believe I was missing something. When I was single, Annie would stop now and then to wipe her runny nose in tears. She didn't ask for leniency or excuses, but confessed her sins over and over again. She apologized for what she had done and how she had betrayed him. Annie then opened up about how she had been longing to break her marriage vows and how it had left her feeling broken. I feel like such an idiot. I had everything, my marriage was perfect, but I feel so ashamed, not because I got caught, but because I hurt you. I hurt my sister. I'm really sorry for what I did. She wrapped her arms around herself and struggled to continue. I swear on all that's holy, you're the only man I've ever made love to. Ever since I saw you, I've never had anyone else inside me. Never, not in my heart, not in my soul. I'm really angry at. I let him do that to me. I let him convince me I was just a notch on his bedpost. I can't believe how stupid I am. I thank God that nothing happened last night. Sadly, Emmy, it did. The physical act of love is irrelevant. You committed stupidity with every secret plot, every stolen kiss, every shared secret. You're not making love to him right now because I screwed up. Otherwise, I'd be a blissful idiot while you satisfied your need with your sister's husband. What you did is beyond stupid. It is pure, pure. You broke your promise to God and man on our wedding day, Annie. I don't know how I can get over it. You were my window to the world, and you became my executioner. The finality struck Annie like a bullet to the heart, and she collapsed to the floor. Curled up in, she started to cry. Her whole body was shaking. It took a few minutes before she was able to speak. She said that she felt as much about losing him as her husband as she did about losing her job. She said that she was devastated by the suffering she had caused him and that she had ruined his life. I'm really sorry if I hurt you, Bob. I didn't get a chance to speak to him. Do you hate me? I don't know. I'm so numb. He fell silent. You were the best husband anyone could have had. I ruined it. I can't say anything except that I'm really sorry for hurting you. I hate myself for what I did. You deserved so much better. I'm going to pack a few things and see if I can find someone to let me stay on their couch tonight. It's not going to be easy when I tell them what I did. I don't think any of my girlfriends will want me around their husbands. Annie sobbed when my mother finds out. She'll disown me. She burst into tears. Bob waited until she stopped sobbing to speak. It's late, and you're not fit to drive. You can sleep on the couch here tonight. Thanks. I promise that I will. Bob raised his hand. This has nothing to do with you. If another person died in a car accident because I forgot something. I couldn't finish the sentence. Annie stood silent, chiding herself for making him remember again. When he pulled himself together, he said, Tomorrow morning, you can pack things. I think we need to be apart for a while. Words hurt like they were physical blows. But tonight you have to call your sister and confess everything. Oh no, she moaned. It would ruin our family. You should have thought of that before you did this. Annie, did you think it would be okay? Yes, I didn't do it. I didn't think about it. Annie looked like she'd been hit by a truck. She was wearing that one black dress that used to look so good on her, but now it just looked like a wash rag. Her eyes were red, her head was down, and she looked like she'd been broken. Bob led her to the door without saying a word. He'd called Carol to let her know they were stopping by, and then he'd turned off their cell phones. When Annie told her sister about what happened, it was like the floodgates opened. It wasn't the first time her husband had cheated on her, and she took all her anger out on her sister. Annie just stood there, taking it stoically. Annie took all the insults in stride, even when Carol said, You're my sister. How could you? The struggle didn't stop until Carol went into premature labor. When Annie tried to help, Carol swung at her and screamed, Keep that cheating away from me. It hit Annie in the right eye. The hospital wasn't far away, so they didn't call an ambulance. Bob grabbed the maternity bag that Kara had packed. Carol demanded that they not call her husband Michael from now on. His name was. That seemed to be the general consensus. He should be called, and not to let him know she was in labor. Bob helped Carol into the back seat and invited Annie to join her, saying she'll help you better than I will. Carol reluctantly accepted her presence. Fear and pain can make a person do things they wouldn't normally do. Annie begged his sister for forgiveness. The whole trip somehow they managed to get deep enough into their souls for Carol to tell the ER nurse that her sister was her llama's coach. A little over an hour later, a doctor came into the waiting room and announced to Bob it's a boy. The mother and son are doing well. The labor and delivery nurse came out next and told Bob that between contractions, she had been calling Annie all sorts of dirty names. Then the most amazing thing happened. Just as the head was born, she started screaming, "I forgive you." It was as if all of the mother's pain had gone away. The two of them hugged, cried, and laughed. I've never seen anything like that before. Bob forced a smile. He thanked her for telling him that Michael would be naming his son Michael Joseph Landry III. Instead, Carol named him after her first husband, Robert Brandon. Annie slept in a chair in the delivery room that night. Bob wasn't religious. He stopped going to church after the accident when he lost Christ. He somehow ended up in the hospital chapel. It was empty, and the only light came from a single candle in a red glass vessel. He sat in the back pew where no one would see him if anyone else came. He was thinking about whether he could forgive his wife. That night, Bob fell asleep after arguing with God about forgiveness. If he was looking for a sign, he got more than enough as the sun rose in the east. The stained glass window above the pulpit began to glow. Bob watched in silence as the image of the risen Christ, 40 feet tall and shining like the sun, lit up hundreds of colors and flooded the room. The light was so bright, it was like the darkness was being overcome. For him, the words, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us," were revealed. Bob was shaking as he noticed the Bible on the pew beside him. He was sure it hadn't been there before. It was open at the verse before Matthew 18:21. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, "Lord, how many times must I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me?" Jesus answered, "I am not telling you 7 times, but 77 times. He stopped in the men's room to freshen up, then went into the cafeteria and bought his wife a cup of coffee and a blueberry scone, her favorite. Annie was holding their nephew in her arms when he walked in. She had an impressive black eye and looked like she'd been after fighting with a company of devils for 2 hours. She turned away and said she was too embarrassed to look him in the eye. Annie handed the infant to her sister and tried to leave the room. Bob stood in front of her. She froze. He put his palms around her face and said, "It took me a long time to forgive. The man who killed Christy, I knew my anger was destroying me, and I had to do it just so I could move on with my life. I don't want to live with that pain again." He put his arm around his wife. "It will take time to heal the wound." He was answered, "I will give you every last beat of my heart. If you ever talk to Michael or anyone else who wants to mess with your head, just know this. It will be over. There will be no second chances. I swear by all that's holy, that I will never give you the slightest reason to question my fidelity to our marriage again. I forgive you because I want to." Annie's happy cry on Monday morning made 2 nurses rush into the room. Annie took her sister and her newfound nephew to see a divorce attorney. Carol wasn't in the mood to forgive. The messages Michael left on Annie's cell phone were very useful for the case. Divorce Bob walked into the company president's office, braced for the worst. He was ready to accept his termination. "Bob, you're a great salesman. I know you have a story to tell me," his boss said. Bob poured out his soul for the next half hour. When he was done, his boss said, "Well, don't just stand there. Get back to work. Just because your presentation brought in the biggest contract this firm has ever had, doesn't mean you can rest on your laurels." Bob danced for joy. 12 months later, Bob found himself in the same delivery room again. Only this time it was Annie's turn. The end.